So things are getting a lot crazier in Venezuela today. Depending upon which sources you are looking at, it looks like there was another coup attempt today in Venezuela dubbed Operation Liberty by Guaido. And what the reason I'm doing this live stream show, and I think this is important, and I'm actually shocked that this was admitted, was that only a couple hours ago, about 2 hours to be exact, U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton, who's a very charming guy, supposedly. I know people who know him. He hangs out with libertarians. He's really good at networking, but he's really a neocon, and he has really, really, really bad foreign policy. He's been involved in a lot of really crazy regime changes and, death squads by U.S. military and regime changes, not only in South America, but all over the globe. And John Bolton actually, in the press conference today, this impromptu press conference on the White House lawn, he was actually pretty darn candid about the U.S.'s plans for Venezuela. Now, he didn't go into all the military plans, but he said all options are on the table. I would say that the U.S. cannot directly put the U.S. military into there because, from my sources, not only do Russian military and Chinese military down there, but you also have Cuba down there, which Fox News is talking about at length because Fox News is now all of a sudden anti-socialist, anti-communist. But my Venezuelan source, who I just spoke to about an hour ago, he told me, because he has family members down in Venezuela still, he escaped Venezuela years ago. I've interviewed him on my channel in the past, and he said that Iran is down there too, intervening. And he said that Iran is involved in the caravans, that, sending them up, financing some of these things, and sending them up, or at least paying for some of it. So it's not just George Soros, it's not just the NGOs, non-governmental organizations, it's not just the rich, hardcore Democrat champion socialists that are flying down to these poor South American countries, like the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, who's just ridiculous. Why isn't he helping the people in California? He's instead on an apology tour down to, Guatemala and El Salvador, and it's just ridiculous. But anyways, though, from what it sounds like, that the U.S. does not want to directly put military in there because there's all these other militaries that are already down there. But John Bolton, during this press conference, he was surprisingly candid about the U.S.'s plans for oil in Venezuela. And one of the few things he actually said that shocked me was he said that, first of all, he was like, as soon as the new government is installed in Venezuela, Juan Guaido's government, he was like, the oil subsidy for Venezuelan citizens is removed. He's like, Venezuelans are going to, all of them, are going to have to start paying market prices for oil. And if you're not familiar with that, there's documentaries out. Real Vision Television even put a free Venezuelan documentary out. I think it's been out about 6 to 8 months. It's about 35 minutes long, and they put it out for free on their YouTube channel. And there's other Venezuelan documentaries out talking about the subsidies for the oil market. And basically, there's just overconsumption of oil in Venezuela because it's artificially cheap. I think it's below 10 cents a gallon for the oil down there. And there's lots of people that, whether it's the socialists here in the U.S., the Democratic socialists, like Bernie Sanders or AOC, blaming U.S. sanctions for all the problems down in Venezuela. But it's a lot more complicated than that, guys. Okay, Venezuela, the government, I've interviewed Jose Nino. He's talked about this. He grew up in Venezuela. His family escaped. There's also articles I'm going to attach for you that you can read. It's from people who escaped Venezuela. Daniel DiMartino, not Danielle. This is a different person. This guy, he's still in college, and he just escaped from Venezuela with his family about 5 or 6 years ago. And his parents live in Spain now, and he's a college student here in the United States. And he's been writing articles going into detail about how mismanaged Venezuela was. Venezuela was so mismanaged, you cannot blame all the problems on the U.S. Okay, the government there, the kleptocrats, the people in power, the bureaucrats, the military, they were stealing anything not tied down. There was almost zero money in Venezuela reinvested into their hospitals, reinvested into their water utilities, reinvested into their electrical utilities, and zero money reinvested into their oil industry. Okay, so their oil industry has been consuming itself, cannibalizing itself for well over a decade. This has been going on since Hugo Chavez was still alive. So Venezuela, I'm not in favor of intervention, obviously. Okay, I'm a libertarian and I want to trade with everyone and make war with no one. But Venezuela was run so poorly by Hugo Chavez and Maduro, it was eventually going to collapse on itself. But the U.S. government doesn't seem to want to let that happen now. And I think a lot of that has to do with how bad the U.S. shale oil producers are. So we are, right now when I'm doing this live stream show, we're at WTI at $63.86 and Brent crude at just under $72 at $71.99. And in this market, my sources, whether it's Bethany, McLean, and others, the shale producers, first of all, these management teams, most of them, except for EOG Resources and some of the other ones, the majority of small and mid-tier independent U.S. shale oil producers, they have never consistently produced, never consistently or never at all produced any profits. And so they have been lying, a lot of these guys have been lying to shareholders, whether it's pension funds or retail investors desperate for income, willing to finance junk bonds. Maybe SEC accredited investors who are willing to do some of these deals. And they have been lying for 10 or 11 years. And so the CapEx now to either increase shale oil production or maintain production levels, the CapEx, it's always been high CapEx, which is, if you're not familiar, people keep asking me, what's CapEx, Jason? What's CapEx? Well, CapEx is capital expenditure. And this is where resource companies and factories get in trouble, because resource companies, even if they're not making money, they still have to maintain property, plant, and equipment. There's a lot of capital, billions of dollars, just to maintain their oil fields, just to maintain their pipelines. There's a bunch of expenses, and the miners are in the same boat, if not worse, for CapEx. So this is why when you're in a bear market cycle and the price is low enough that the miners they don't even have the cash flow to maintain CapEx. So they can't maintain their property, plant, and equipment. Okay, they can't replace reserves, they can't do drilling. There's a bunch of different things they just don't have the cash flow to do. Now, if they were profitable and they had free cash flow, they could afford these things. And this is what the shale oil companies are running into now. So for the last, 10 years, give or take, the shale oil companies have been able to raise many hundreds of billions of dollars in capital, in equity, in junk bonds, that basically the investors were promised returns on. And the management teams, a lot of these management teams were promising earnings, they were promising free cash flow, they were promising dividends, etc. And they have not delivered on those. And from what I'm hearing, the sources I'm hearing, and I don't know if all the shale companies have disclosed this, they don't have to issue press releases really for investor lawsuits, but if it's in like an annual report, normally the lawyers stick it in the small section, in the footnotes or in the index, like lawsuits, or it's in risk for the company. It'll be hidden in there, deep in like a 100-page report. It'll be like on page 50 in a small paragraph with small font. And there are, according to my sources, just an insane amount of lawsuits against the shale companies. Not only are they from local governments because the infrastructure has been destroyed and the oil companies are not chipping in to replace the infrastructure that the roads and the other parts that they've destroyed. So the local taxpayer in those communities is going to get hit. But the shale oil companies are getting sued by environmentalists, and most importantly, they're getting sued by their own investors because most of them have not delivered on the dividends or the profits that were promised. And that was the guidelines for them getting the financing. So it appears that to offset this as a hedge, the U.S. is focusing now on trying to increase Venezuelan oil production, which from what I've heard is at 500,000 barrels per day or lower now. And at one point, Venezuelan oil production, its peak maximum oil production was 4 million barrels per day. So it's just an enormous drop, and you can't blame the U.S. for that. That is Venezuelan inefficiency, Venezuelan ineptitude for why they have gone from 4 million barrels of oil production down to 500,000 barrels per day or lower. So I just wanted to do this short little video and tell you guys about that. It seems that the U.S. is worried about problems in shale. We've got President Trump now in addition, and this is even shocking to me. Not only has his lackeys, the trumpets like Larry Kudlow and even Federal Reserve Board of Governors, saying that they need, despite the stock market at or near all-time highs, the stock market indices, 50 basis point cuts. Now President Trump just said today he wants 1% cuts. So he wants it doubled. The cuts doubled. The Koch brothers want their revenge against Chavez. Well, I'm not familiar with what you're saying about the Koch brothers, but I forgot to mention this earlier. So John Bolton was one of the main guys with Dick Cheney before the Iraq War. And before the U.S. invaded Iraq, we found this out from good reporting and declassified government documents that Dick Cheney and his war generals, and I think John Bolton, had meetings with all the major oil company executives, ExxonMobil, Royal Dutch Shell, BP, Chevron, those guys. And they wanted a map of where all the major oil fields were in Iraq and all the pipelines were and the refineries were, so they didn't accidentally bomb those. So the plan that we were sold, and it was a lie, obviously, because the Iraq War was an enormous waste of money, I think way over $1 trillion wasted, but the lie, not only was it weapons of mass destruction lie that the American people and taxpayers were sold, but if you remember, the American people were told that after the U.S. invaded Iraq, that we would take over their oil fields, the U.S. oil companies would be running those, and not getting oil service contracts, and that the war in Iraq, the regime change of Saddam Hussein, would pay for itself. And obviously that didn't happen. So it looks like the strategy is a little bit different than Iraq, because I saw during the press conference with John Bolton that one of the reporters had the balls, I'm not sure which reporter it was, but he asked John Bolton about exactly that stuff about Iraq. He was like, didn't you guys say that the war in Iraq was going to pay for itself with all the oil we were going to, produce, that American oil companies were going to produce? Sci-Flyer says Chavez nationalized some of the Koch brothers companies. They also nationalized a lot of other oil company assets. Chavez nationalized everything, okay? And he made it so there was really almost no foreign direct investment by a private corporation. So if you wanted to build automobiles in Venezuela, you had to share technology, the intellectual property, and give them the profits. So, I mean, he did this. Chavez, with his bad economic policy, he did this to himself. Wage and price controls, eliminating foreign investment. So Chavez started this whole thing. And if you go back and listen, Chavez made it worse. It was getting bad before. The interview I did with Jose Nino about 4 or 5 months ago is really good. And he's been saying for a couple of years now, he's been writing articles for the Mises Institute about how Venezuela started getting really bad in the 50s and 60s. And then every couple decades, it would just get worse. And if the oil price was high, it would fix things for a while. So the government would be able to run surpluses. The government would be able to give out more social program money, invest in infrastructure, those types of things. But the government didn't save money. Anytime the oil price went up, it just handed out more and more money, and it didn't save any money for a rainy day. And a lot of these other governments are doing the same thing. It's just Venezuela, I think almost 100% of their foreign revenue comes from oil exports. So they don't really export anything else to make money for the country other than oil now. That's how inefficient their economy is. That's how much damage Hugo Chavez and Maduro have done, is that Venezuela doesn't really export anything like oil. And so oil is very cyclical. The price is very volatile. And when the oil price was higher, Chavez and Maduro promised a lot of extra social program spending, and they didn't save any of the money. They didn't reinvest any of those oil profits into hospitals, into water and electrical utilities, into infrastructure, into improving the refinery and their oil, the refinery for their oil, their national-owned oil company. So they didn't do the prudent things that should have been done. And instead, the overreaction was to implement like wage and price controls, ban foreign investment, and blame things on the U.S. And yes, there is U.S. sanctions, but you cannot. The path was long before the U.S. put sanctions on Venezuela. Venezuela was already on a bad path. So it looks like Venezuela, things are going to accelerate now. We'll see what happens with the military intervention. Like I said, it's very complicated because the U.S. military looks like cannot directly get involved there because of how many, counting here, there's Russia, China, Cuba, and Iran. So there's at least 4 different countries down there in Venezuela with military intervention trying to prevent the U.S. military from getting directly involved. So I would say the U.S. is not going to directly get involved, but that doesn't mean the U.S. won't finance additional coup attempts. But things are just getting crazier, and I think basically the U.S. Bolton admitted today it's all about oil, and he announced some of his oil plans, which I was shocked to hear. Okay, I'll take a look at the questions and comments. I only did this for 15 minutes. This was very impromptu because I wanted to tell you guys what I heard from the John Bolton press conference there. So the fact that he already is announcing plans for the Venezuelan economy and what they're going to do with the oil market down there. And it sounds like that there's already a mass migration crisis out of Venezuela. If you've seen the pictures, you've seen a lot of Venezuelans trying to cross the bridge to get into Colombia, and then they don't have a work permit. And there's a lot of really, really sad things that Venezuelans are having to do to survive, even women and children. But from what my Venezuelan source said, he said it could get even crazier. Adrian's got it right. Leave Venezuela alone in their own mess. So this would be the anti-interventionist foreign policy. This would be the libertarian trade with everyone, make war with no one, which is what I think George Washington said after the U.S. was first founded, right? The U.S. and the Barbary pirates, right? We got involved. I forget exactly where, but the U.S. it was labeled isolationist foreign policy, but it was really just non-interventionist. And for a while, we mostly just wanted to focus on trading with other countries and not intervening in other countries' conflicts. I'm reading some of your comments now. Hey Jesse, this is just a quick show today. I wasn't really planning on it, but the stuff going down in Venezuela is crazy. Edward Snowden's tweeting about it, so there's some interesting stuff coming out from Edward Snowden on his Twitter if you want to take a look. And Zero Hedge on their Venezuelan article has already done 5 or 6 updates. So they've been updating it. I see 5 updates right now. There's been 5 updates just today on the Venezuelan article. At the top of at the front page, the first story. That is interesting, Calvin. YouTube has censored most of the news out of Venezuela. Well, it's YouTube, when it push comes to shove, man, YouTube wants to get in bed. Google and YouTube want to get in bed with the big government. So Google and YouTube want those contracts from China. They want those contracts from the European Union. They want those contracts from the U.S. government. So when push comes to shove, they will probably, acquiesce to whatever the large federal government tells them to do. Now, maybe they will fight some of the things in court or pay a fine, but if there's a carrot dangle, the big government contract in exchange for screwing over their own customers or screwing over people who give email addresses and personal information, I think these large technology companies will do it. Richard asked, will Libya repeat itself in Venezuela? That is a good question. I mean, Libya is a disaster. As the last I heard, there's actually slavery. There's slave auctions now in Libya. That's how much of a disaster Libya is. And I don't know what Libyan oil production is right now, but they were trying to get a little bit of it back, and I think it's way below 50% of its former high levels. And Muammar Gaddafi was a puppet for a while he was a puppet, and then we lost control of him, I believe. But yeah, he was not a good person either. That was the Sacha Baron Cohen made that movie to make fun of him, right? The Dictator. Because a lot of that stuff was based, I think, on Muammar Gaddafi, if I remember correctly. It is a funny movie, though. Yeah, so I don't know exactly if the details about the Koch brothers, but a lot of oil companies were screwed over. A lot of mining companies were screwed over in Venezuela. The sad part of the situation is that Venezuela should be by far the richest country in South America. It actually was, I think, in the 50s and 60s. And as it became more and more socialist, bad economic policy, lack of freedom of speech, things just got worse and worse. Venezuela has really good agriculture. It should have really good tourism. It should have mining. It should have manufacturing. It used to have very smart, well-educated people. It used to have some of the best and brightest people in the oil industry. And there has been a mass exodus for years, long before the last couple years, of the most talented Venezuelan oil people have left that country. Some of them have gone to Colombia, some of them have gone to other Latin American countries, and some of them have come to here to the U.S. But Venezuela should be the best economy in Latin America. Venezuela should be like the California of Latin America. Well, California is not even as good as it used to be, right? California, theoretically, should be by far the best economic state in the United States. Now, GDP-wise, it still says that, but in reality, California is not the best economic state anymore. California is a disaster. California has beautiful climate. It should have agriculture, movies, tourism, Silicon Valley. There should be oil and gas, mining, all these different. It should have an extremely well-diversified economy with low taxes, and it should be super efficient. And the crazy people in California who have voted in these politicians and bureaucrats, California is turning into an absolute disaster, and that's why you're seeing people in California leave like crazy. And the rich people who are leaving California, well, not so rich people too, are going to other states, and eventually they will ruin those other states too with high taxes and rules, regulations, red tape, and electing crazy, probably very socialist politicians. Yeah, right now, Adrian, Chile is probably the best, but I'm just saying on potential alone that Venezuela has more. Venezuela has far more potential. And in fact, Venezuela was the top South American economy for many, many years. Yeah, Chile is the best right now, but Venezuela has a lot more potential than Chile. But unfortunately, Venezuela is a disaster, and the situation, there shouldn't be any foreign intervention by any of these governments. Because, let's face it, you guys, China's not going to Venezuela to save the Venezuelan people. China's going there to protect their own interests. They're going there because they're a loan shark. They're after their oil or their copper or their gold. They're after whatever. So the Venezuelan government, Maduro's government, and Chavez before that took loan money from Chinese on very, very bad terms, and now the Chinese have the Venezuelans over a barrel. Same thing with the Russians. So the Venezuelan people are not benefiting from the deal that was done that the Maduro government did with China. The Venezuelan people it's just worse for them. There's still enormous shortages of food and other stuff, and you can't blame the U.S. for all the problems. Okay, there's food shipments that the Venezuelan government either the food is rotting before it's delivered, or the food trucks are stolen and hijacked now. It's crazy what's going on in Venezuela. Okay, taking a look at more of your listener questions and comments. Anyone else getting the stream broken? Well, a lot of people who are subscribed to my channel and have also gotten the notification bell, they don't even receive a notice that I turned on the live stream now. YouTube wants me gone, guys. They really made it almost impossible to grow my channel at all anymore. And I don't get any Google AdWords revenue money, really. Almost all my videos are automatically demonetized, and then they have to manually protest them, and sometimes they get turned back on. Rhino Nation, how dare Venezuela want to keep U.S. oil companies from our oil that we've temporarily stored under their land? Well, Rhino, it's more complicated than that. So if like ExxonMobil or Royal Dutch Shell invested billions of dollars into Venezuela, into infrastructure, pipelines, property, plant, and equipment, it is morally and ethically wrong for a government, any government, Venezuela, any government, to just seize their private property and not give them any cash back, okay? So Venezuela maybe could have slightly raised the taxes, but that's not what happened. It was just blatantly stolen. So it's more complicated than what you're claiming, okay? If I invest, this would be the smaller micro example. If we made a contract and I gave you money to do something on the contract and you violated it and you said, fuck you, I'm never giving you any money, I don't owe you shit, and we have a contract and we're in a country that respects private property and you try to do that, I could sue you or I would have rights. But because it's a government, they think that they can get away with it. Okay, so it's more complicated than that. And this is what comes down to socialism. Socialism is theft. Okay, socialism is slavery. There are a bunch of very smart people long before I was born who are saying bad things about socialism, warning us. And you know what? All those warnings have been ignored or forgotten. Okay, well, that's it for right now. Just doing this short little thing to talk about the oil market. But if the U.S. can get that 4 million barrels back of production, if if Maduro wanted to get the U.S. off his back, he would just allow foreign investment in oil companies again and say, you know what, we're going to allow foreign investment, we're going to tax them at a certain rate, and I think the U.S. would back off. But Maduro's not going to do that. He's far too stupid and far too much of an ideologue to do that. So it is what it is, man. The situation's going to run its course. I don't know how things are going to play out, but things are crazy. You have 4 different foreign governments at least down there, and the U.S. is seeding coup attempts. And if this one fails today, they're not going to give up. They still see that oil as the prize. But if the Venezuelan government wanted this to end, they would just allow foreign direct investment into their oil industry so they can increase their oil production. But it seems that the socialists are too dumb or too idealistic to do anything like that. Okay, well, that's it for now. Everyone have a nice rest of your day, and we're going to keep monitoring the situation right now.